Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth session of the 53rd FINEX Annual Conference. The theme of this session is working towards an integrated Asia-Pacific. May I now call back our MC for today, Mr. Carlo Enrico Lazatin.
Good afternoon, fellow FINEX members and guests. Welcome to the fourth session of the 53rd Annual FINEX Week Conference. The theme of this year's conference is Inclusive Disruption, Achieving Sustainable Future in the New Frontier. This year, we'll be rolling out a series of webinars involving prestigious speakers discussing thought-provoking topics. Our fourth session this afternoon will focus on working towards an integrated Asia-Pacific. Our speakers today are more than equipped to discuss about international banking and how organizations can further enable economic growth and promote infrastructure development in Asia-Pacific. Our first speaker is Dr. Bambam Susantono. Dr. Susantono is the Vice President of Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development of the Asian Development Bank. He holds a PhD in Infrastructure Planning and 2 master's degrees in Transportation Engineering and City and Regional Planning from the University of California, Berkeley. He has a bachelor's degree in engineering from Civil Engineering Department, the Bundang Institute of Technology. Dr. Susantono is responsible for managing knowledge in ADB and coordinating research and studies on various topics. He also coordinates ADB's annual flagship publications, such as the Asian Development Outlook, Key Indicators of Asia-Pacific, and Asian Regional Economic Integration Report. Prior to this, Dr. Susan Tono was the acting minister and vice minister of Transportation of Indonesia and deputy minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development at the Office of Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs. He was also a member of the board for airline, port, telecommunications, and media companies. He chaired several research institutes and taught in universities as well. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Bambang Susantono.
A very good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Asian Development Bank, it is my great pleasure to join you again at the Financial Executive Institute of the Philippines Annual Conference to share our views on inclusive disruptions and how to achieve a sustainable future. I had the honor to speak at this conference 2 years ago, and since then, a lot has happened across Asia and the world. In addition to its devastating impact on health, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to cause unprecedented disruptions throughout our economies and societies. It has widened inequalities and damaged some development progress. At ADB, we actively support governments and our private sector partners respond to the effects of the pandemic and help forge recovery strategies. Stronger regional cooperation and integrations is crucial in fighting the pandemic and working toward recovery. For example, we need to work together to harness digital technology for the innovative, dynamic economies of tomorrow. An inclusive and integrated Asia means a digitally connected Asia. Even before the pandemic, digital technology was a foundation for more inclusive growth. Our region's ability to take advantage of this technology has allowed greater internet traffic, wider digital access, and more technological collaborations. For example, between 2010 and 2020, the region's internet bandwidth using routes across Asia and the Pacific increased from 1.7 to 85 terabytes per second. In 2010, only 1 of 4 Asians had access to the internet. By 2020, it had increased to nearly 3 out of 4. As more Asians go online, the potential for the digital economy grows exponentially. Even before the pandemics, Asia's digital platforms accounted for over half of global e-commerce. In 2019, global digital platform revenues reached almost $3.8 trillion, the equivalent of 4.4% of global GDP. Asia accounted for slightly less than half, while the United States had 22% and the Euro area just 11%. The region's digital financial services also grew with digital payments reaching new records each year. The World Payment Report shows $243.6 billion in non-cash transactions in Asia and the Pacific in 2019, the highest worldwide. This came out of greater smartphone use and e-commerce and use of innovative payments such as digital wallets and QR codes. Our region is driving growth in global business-to-consumer e-commerce. In 2020, Asia spent $2.5 trillion of the $3.9 trillion global total for retail e-commerce. North America had the second largest share with around $749 billion, less than a third of Asia and the Pacific. Future e-commerce growth is forecast well into double digits, driven by a growing middle class, greater mobile and internet access, better logistics and infrastructure. There will be more digital consumers as well as businesses adopting digital sales. E-commerce revenue growth will be solid over the next 4 years in countries like India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Thailand. The business potential for Asia's e-commerce, integrating regionally and globally, is enormous. Businesses will be able to more easily enter supply chains and export markets and extend their online customer base. A recent company survey showed a seven-fold increase in the rate at which companies are developing digital offerings. E-commerce support inclusion and last-mile access for entrepreneurs typically locked out of traditional market, particularly women-owned businesses and small businesses in rural areas or small Pacific Island states. The World Bank recently estimated that women-owned businesses going digital could boost Southeast Asia e-commerce market by $280 billion. ADB supports women entrepreneurs leverage digital technology, including e-commerce, to gain access to regional markets and trade opportunities. For example, our road improvement project in Tajikistan had integrated a component to provide skills training to women on business development, grant proposal writing, and financial management. 137 women subsequently received conditional grants to start businesses. Let me speak briefly about Fintech, which can play an important role in promoting inclusions. A recent ASEAN survey, for example, showed 45% of clients reached by Fintech solutions are either unbanked or underbanked. Mobile money services for the unbanked soared by more than 25 times globally over the past decade. Importantly, fintechs makes financial transactions more affordable for much of the populations. It has been key to reducing remittance costs for migrant workers by more than half, from 6% to about 2.7% of the remittance value. And fintechs has become a survival tool during strict pandemic lockdowns. Indeed, digital financial services have grown rapidly during the pandemic. Here in the Philippines, for example, GCash, the mobile wallet company, increased its transaction volume over 2.5 times in 2020. Its user base grew from 20 million in 2019 to 33 million in 2020. ADB supports expanding digital finance with a particular focus on reaching the underserved. For example, in the Philippines, we support a cloud-based core banking system with Kantilan Bank to offer financial services in rural Mindanao. This has benefited small businesses, farmers, women, and youth. In Indonesia, we have multi-year policy-based loan with the government to support regulatory reform for financial inclusions. These reforms, for example, allow alternative credit mechanisms using fintechs and artificial intelligence to promote financial inclusions while strengthening supervisions and consumer protections. The program also increases the number of women entrepreneurs working in fintech where they remain a minority. Fintechs has been an innovation catalyst for financial system. It encouraged banks to adopt digital technologies and leverage applications to reduce costs and improve efficiency. Digital banks are also growing across the region. 3 fintech companies already have digital bank licenses in the Republic of Korea. Singapore approved 2 full bank digital licenses and 2 digital wholesale bank licenses in December 2020. Here, the first digital bank license was awarded to Neobank Tonic in March 2021. Overall, more than 200 digital banks have been established globally since 2010, of which 46 are in Asia and the Pacific. Fintechs also allow central banks to digitize national payment systems. For example, the National Bank of Cambodia's Bakong project will introduce an all-in-one mobile payment and banking apps for online banking and other financial services. Similar initiatives are underway across ASEAN, including the Philippines, which will help boost efficiency and financial inclusion. I would like to highlight 4 key areas that we must work on to better harness digital technology in our pandemic recovery efforts. The first is to promote digital literacy and digital financial literacy. Digital literacy requires proficiency in information technology, critical thinking, and communicating. Digital financial literacy means harnessing the skills to use digital financial products and services to make informed financial decisions. In Indonesia, we work with the Financial Services Authority to launch e-modules on financial literacy for elementary and high school students. We also support digital financial literacy as part of the Smart Digital Indonesia series and experiential financial education programs such as Y-Bank, which targets youth. Second, we need better cybersecurity laws and data protections. Criminal activity violating data integrity and privacy and scams have become a major risk to everyone, individual and businesses. Cybercrime likely amounted to $1 trillion globally in 2020, doubling in just 2 years. Threats have grown in both scope and scale, particularly in financial services, a natural target for cybercriminals. Global spending on cybersecurity was over $145 billion last year, with high reputational costs for financial institutions. I must say that financial institutions and companies are better prepared today to mitigate this risk, but cybersecurity has become essential to business operations and strategic planning. Looking ahead, we need a holistic approach to better cybersecurity. There are relatively simple platforms that share intelligence on incidents in real time with financial and non-financial companies, and governments should continue to adopt transparent and globally compatible cybersecurity standards while balancing this with the need to preserve competitions and innovation. Third, we should use digital technology more for better financial regulation and supervision. RegTech lets financial institutions use machine learning, cloud computing, blockchain technology, biometrics, cryptography to meet compliance and reporting requirements. It improves efficiency and transparency while also enhancing analytical capabilities and standardizing data management for financial regulations. SupTech, on the other hand, plays a role in streamlining operations and helps automate supervisor reports and data collections. It can help standardize reporting and regulatory practices and handle the massive volume of new digitalized data. More real-time evaluation is needed, given the new risk to systemic stability. As of July this year, nearly half of Southeast Asia's financial authorities have RegTech and SupTech initiatives, including the Philippine Central Bank. Together, we must work to supervise our financial systems in a smarter, more efficient, and less costly way. Fourth, we need to make our national regulatory system more compatible and adopt international standards. The governing principle and mechanism of both e-commerce and fintech are scattered across different legal frameworks. Digital regulatory cooperation creates more coherent and coordinated regulatory approaches, encourages digital interoperability, and ensures that national standards are aligned with international principles and guidelines. This needs to cover electronic transmissions, consumer protections, and privacy and data protections, all essential for e-commerce and fintech. Some progress has been made, as you can see in the pie charts, but much remains to be done. Government need to work with multilateral standardization bodies and support national agencies to align regulatory regimes with international standards. Finally, we continue to see uneven basic digital infrastructure and varying degrees of digital readiness. For example, digital platform penetrations and network readiness vary widely across Asian economies. In the left side panel, for example, the deeper tones show better digital access, resources, skills, and affordability. For those with poor access and infrastructure, we need to redouble our work to close the digital divide and expand investment in digital infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude with some thoughts on our conference theme. The opportunities digital technology offers to our region are unprecedented. digital-enabled businesses, jobs, incomes, and fintech to be the cornerstone for the next chapter in Asia's economic progress. We must continue working together to harness the power of these digital transformations. Its challenges can be overcome by strengthening digital and financial literacy and adapting legal and regulatory frameworks to ensure cybersecurity. Also, it is important to strengthen data and privacy protection while increasing investment to bridge the digital divide. I look forward for today's discussions how we can all work together to ensure digital technology can lead to a more integrated and financially inclusive Asia. Thank you. Maraming salamat po.
We'd like to thank Dr. Susan Tono for taking your time in sending us your pre-recorded message. We will definitely miss you in the open forum. Our next speaker is Mr. Jose Isidro Camacho. Mr. Camacho is a managing director in the Asia-Pacific division of Credit Suisse, based in Singapore. He is also the vice chairman for Credit Suisse Asia-Pacific. Mr. Camacho joined Credit Suisse in March 2005 after a distinguished career in government and international banking. He was appointed as the Secretary of Finance for the Philippines in 2001, a position he held until November 2003. Prior to that, Mr. Camacho was the Secretary of Energy for the Philippines, where he was credited with the successful passage of the country's power sector reform legislation. Mr. Camacho is currently a director of Sim Asia Foundation Singapore, a founding member of Asia-Pacific, Asia Peace and Reconciliation Council Thailand, non-executive chairman of Sun Life Canada Philippines, a board member of Sun Life Grepa Financial Incorporated Philippines, and Sun Life Malaysia Assurance Berhad. He's also a senior advisor to the Boston Consulting Group in Singapore and a member of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank's International Advisory Panel in China. Mr. Camacho obtained his bachelor's degree in mathematics cum laude from the De La Salle University in 1975. He received his MBA with concentration in finance from Harvard University in 1979. In March 2017, Mr. Camacho was awarded an honorary degree of Doctor of Business Administration from Eastern Asia University in Thailand. Just last August 2021, he was a recipient of the Public Service Medal, Pingat Bakti Masyarakat, a Singaporean National Honor Medal for the year 2021. Let's now welcome Mr. Jose Isidro Camacho.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Good afternoon, my friends in the FINEX, ladies and gentlemen. It was less than 2 years ago that I spoke at your annual conference in person. I remember at the Grand Hyatt in BGC on the topic of an overview and the outlook for the Asia-Pacific capital markets. It must have been your last physical event, which is as an organization before the world was struck with this pandemic, which is profoundly changing our world as individuals and as professionals. As I said then, I am delighted to join you and our other very distinguished speakers today for your annual conference, having been a FINEX member myself from the early 1980s and considering you all as members of my family of financial professionals. I would also like to congratulate your organizing committee for organizing the annual conference this year around the very relevant topics or themes of inclusiveness and sustainability. For those of you who were present during my remarks in 2019, you may remember my last message, which I would like to repeat, and I quote myself. Finally, our Earth is in crisis, and it is our collective responsibility to contribute to the wide array of solutions. Every individual action will count, but as a financial community, we can contribute even more by promoting responsible business practices and expanding the financial resources available for environmental, sustainable, and social endeavors, end of quote. Thank you, FINEX, for your leadership in keeping these very relevant themes, particularly on sustainability, very much top of mind for your members. For today's session, I have been tasked to speak on the topic of working towards an integrated Asia-Pacific. While I readily accepted your invitation, I have to confess that I had to pause to reflect on my assigned topic, as I was not sure what I can say to support the theme. I had to speak to one of your organizers, Mike Guarin, to clarify what was the intent of this session. While the topic of an integrated Asia-Pacific is very appealing and ideal, however, I am not sure that our current environment, and indeed our environment for many years to come, is supportive of achieving such regional integration. Let me tell you why. For a couple of decades, many of the world's noted thinkers have started talking about the 21st century as the Asian century. Our region is expected to take global center stage, with the world transitioning from a century of US dominance, and before that, centuries of global power and influence of Great Britain and the other major European powers. Asia's emergence began with the birth of the Asian tigers in the 1980s and 1990s. The region's swift recovery after the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. And more recently, the emergence of China as the world's second largest economy, and eventually will be the largest, with a global influence now competing and at times surpassing that of the US. Asia's expected position does not even reflect the unrealized potential of another sleeping Asian giant, India, and the satellite economies of the India subcontinent. The case for the Asian century is therefore undeniable. You may ask then, why am I pessimistic of achieving regional integration today? For one, domestic politics across the world has changed from one that was characterized and driven by the fruits of globalization, free trade, economic integration, and multilateralism, to that of nationalism, especially economic nationalism, populism, and inward-looking policies. The election of Donald Trump as US president accentuated this, but he was by no means the only obvious example of this new wave of policymaking. New political leaders have succeeded under this banner of nationalism and insular focus, even within our ASEAN region. I do not think that a political leader today will be able to stay in power or get elected under an agenda of regional integration. To cite an example, ASEAN declared the aim for an ASEAN Community 2020 in 2003. In the ASEAN leaders meeting that happened in our own Cebu in the Philippines in 2007, this was even accelerated to 2015. An important component of this framework for the is the ASEAN Economic Community 2020, which aims to allow for the freer flow of merchandise, services, capital, and skilled labor amongst the ASEAN member countries. While we did achieve part of this with the removal of tariffs across almost all merchandise, I'm afraid that very little progress has been made in the other critical components of services, capital, and labor. Even in Singapore, where I reside and I work, which stands to gain from ASEAN's integration, given its dominant position in many sectors like financial services, petrochemicals, pharma, biotech, etc., have had to shift its policy towards foreign talent after its disappointing results in the general and presidential elections of 2011 and subsequent elections. They have increasingly introduced tighter controls and new limits on the influx of unskilled and skilled labor, foreign labor, including those from the Philippines. Another significant factor that makes regional integration more challenging is the continuing conflict between the two global superpowers, the US and China, across many arenas. The emergence of China has made the US more hostile and aggressive in trying to contain China and limit its geopolitical influence. Again, Trump exemplified this by starting a winner-take-all trade war or tariff war, extended this to an intense technology-driven competition, and a world war on the origin of the current COVID-19 pandemic. If we are to believe what has been reported on the calls between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the US, General Mark Milley, and his Chinese counterpart, just a few days before the US presidential election last year, and again shortly after the US Capitol Hill assault in January, we were probably closer to a military confrontation between the two superpowers than we could have imagined. Biden's victory has been a big relief for the rest of the world, reeling from Trump's unpredictable and erratic behavior and pronouncements. However, I believe, as do most people, that this will not reduce the level of tension between the two superpowers. The decibel may come down, but the substance of their differences remain. The anti-Chinese sentiment was never a Trump or Republican idea. It is a bipartisan agenda in the US, and one that permeates across a large segment of American society. I am sure that recent incidents of personal attacks on Asian or Asian-looking persons in the US, even in a cosmopolitan place like New York City, is but a manifestation of this growing anti-Chinese sentiment in the US. Certainly in my lifetime, or what remains of it, I consider the US-China conflict as the defining global megatrend that will impact the rest of us for many years to come. It is a looming clash of cultures between a declining superpower with a tendency to impose its values and way of life on the rest of the world, and an emerging superpower that has gone through 2 centuries of humiliation and has a very different take on issues like human rights, international rule of law, and other Western conventions. This new superpower is also poised to flex its muscles, mainly through its economic weapons of trade and investments, but occasionally, and rather crudely, through military actions, such as its aggressive build-up in the disputed South China Sea territories. Sadly, this superpower has not yet developed the diplomatic skills and the use of soft power, being new in the game. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid and I believe that this conflict will be this generation's Cold War. It will profoundly influence regional and global developments, including the aspiration for an integrated Asia-Pacific. In this bipolar world we are facing, Asian economies like the Philippines will be under continuing pressure from both superpowers to choose sides, whether on trade issues, the choice of technology to adapt, or policy making in international institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, WHO, or the United Nations. The rest of Asia will be confronted having to make a choice, and there will be consequences. You may remember that when Australia became vocal with the rest of the Western countries on the issue of the Uyghurs in China, China's retaliation on their importations from Australia was immediate. Sitting on the fence or trying to please both superpowers will increasingly become very difficult, if not impossible. In this regard, initiatives to strengthen regional integration will be compromised, as many Asian countries may have to prioritize their bilateral relations with the US and or China over these regional aspirations. As an illustration, you may still recall the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting that was held in Cambodia in 2012, which failed to issue a joint statement for the first time in the ASEAN's 45-year history because Cambodia, as the meeting chairman, would not agree or could not agree on the statement that criticized China's aggression in the South China Seas. You can easily tell where Cambodia's priority was. On the other hand, you will find that in the list of members of the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, which was initiated by China, the list has two very prominent non-member countries, the US and Japan. One can only surmise why Japan, Asia's second largest economy, has decided not to join the AIIB. In a less subtle way, just last month, the US, the United Kingdom, and Australia signed a trilateral security partnership, which includes the enablement of Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines. While not mentioning the target of this agreement by name, it is clear to most that this is in response to China's expansionist moves in the South China Seas and the increasing pressures towards Taiwan. Another manifestation of the lack of cohesion among Asian countries towards regional integration is the proliferation of regional blocks of various combinations and acronyms, excuse me, that it makes it difficult for any layman to follow. In recent years, you can add to ASEAN, ASEAN plus 3, and APEC, the establishment of RCEP or RCEP and TPP, later renamed as CPTPP after Trump withdrew the US participation. Not to mention numerous bilateral and other sub-regional partnerships. Just for reference, RCEP, or Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is a free trade agreement that is an extension of the ASEAN plus 3 framework, which is comprised of the 10 ASEAN members plus the 3 large North Asian economies of China, Japan, and South Korea. In RCEP, Australia and New Zealand joined the original ASEAN plus 3 to create a trading bloc that today represents 30% of the world's population and 30% of global GDP. It was signed virtually last November 2020, and it will become effective after it has been ratified by at least 6 ASEAN members and 3 of the non-ASEAN countries. It aims to eliminate 90% of all tariffs on imports amongst the members within a 20-year time frame. It will also establish common rules of e-commerce, trade, and intellectual property rights. As noted by many Western commentators, however, it will not include and does not include common values and aspirations around labor, human rights, and environmental and sustainability issues. The TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, on the other hand, was an initiative originally led and supported by the US and seemed to be competing with RCEP. It was signed in February of 2016, but Trump withdrew the US participation from the agreement a year later. Today, it has been renamed Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for TPP, or CPTPP, and includes 4 ASEAN countries of Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand from Asia Pacific, and Canada, Mexico, Chile, and Peru from the Americas. Interestingly, and I would say very cleverly, China has recently applied for membership in CPTPP. Let me now speak on the two other big elephants in the room that need to be discussed when talking about the integration of Asia-Pacific. One is obvious and implied in my earlier remarks. Can the rest of Asia accept an integrated region where China will likely be playing increasingly a dominant role? For RCEP to work, can the rest of the members allow China to take the lead in writing the trade rules? Or will the other Asian countries continue to look to the US to act as political, economic, and military counterbalance, which may further increase the tension between the two superpowers? Can China, on the other hand, develop diplomatic skills and the use of soft power and allow for real discussions and negotiations on economic, social, and political conventions for the region with the rest of the members? Or will it constantly rely on bully tactics by using the magnitude of its trade, investments, and even tourism, and its military might to pressure its neighbors? China will surely emerge as the world's largest economy, with a fast expanding domestic consumption, a growing outward tourism, and an outsized capital markets that is still very domestic, but with the potential of being a regional financial market. It can be at the center of an integrated Asia-Pacific, but it will have to learn to adapt and adjust to more universal values, standards, and practices to be an effective leader. The other elephant in the room is the role of India in the future of Asia. India is the second largest country by population today and is expected to surpass China within the next few years. By 2020, India is projected to have 1.5 billion people. And yet today, it only ranks 7th largest in world GDP, with an economy that is about a fifth of China's. India's population, however, is very young, with more than 50% of its population below the age of 25. And it produces a disproportionate number of IT-savvy professionals. India's growth has been stunted in the past by its dysfunctional political system and its legacy of protectionism and economic entitlements. But with its young population that is well suited for a world that is becoming more digital, India should be able to grow its economy at a much faster rate than what it has done historically. In my lifetime, I can see India achieving its full potential and growing to be top 3 economy in the world. And when it does, how will its new position change the dynamics of leadership within Asia? For Asia-Pacific to truly flourish, it will be important to integrate India and its neighboring countries in the India subcontinent into the rest of the region. Imagine, for example, an expansion of RCEP to include the India subcontinent economies. It will be surely the largest trading bloc in the world and allow for free trade amongst half of the world's population. I do hope that the leaders of our region will find the will and the way to realize this possibility. Ladies and gentlemen, I do share your vision of an integrated Asia-Pacific. It is an ideal world that can uplift the lives of over 1.2 billion Asians still living in poverty. It can create a regional financial architecture that is less dependent on the US dollar and allow the free flow of capital from the mature economies to the developing economies of Asia. It can help maintain a region of peace and reduce military tensions amongst neighbors. It can promote better understanding amongst our peoples with more intra-regional travel and cultural exchanges. More importantly, It can provide for stronger regional cooperation so that we can more effectively tackle global challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic and our climate change crisis. In our world that is faced with grave health, environmental, and security challenges, we cannot fail and must not fail in bringing our region together. The dawn of the Asian century has come. The question will be whether all of Asia Pacific will prosper as one community, or it will be a region of contradictions. Ladies and gentlemen, the choice is ours and ours to do something about. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to our panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Camacho. Definitely a great jumping board for the discussion later. Our last speaker is Dr. Julius Cesar Parrenas. Dr. Parrenas is a senior advisor of the Daiwa Institute of Research at the Daiwa Securities Group. He coordinates the Asia-Pacific Financial Forum, the Asia-Pacific Infrastructure Partnership, and the Financial Infrastructure Development Network. He represents the APEC Business Advisory Council in the APEC Finance Ministers process. From November 2017 to 2020, he was senior advisor at Mizuho Bank Limited. From 2016 to October 2017, he was senior advisor at Nomura, the Research Institute, and from 2014 to August 2016, he was senior advisor at Nomura Securities Limited and Nomura Institute of Capital Markets Research. From 2009 to 2014, he was advisor on international affairs of the Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi UFJ Limited and senior advisory fellow of the Institute for International Monetary Affairs in Tokyo. From 1998 to 2009, Dr. Parrenas was senior advisor to the chairman of China Trust Financial Holdings Company Limited and also the policy advocacy coordinator of the Asian Bankers Association. He was also the alternate member of the APEC Business Advisory Council from 2000 to 2009. He received his PhD magna cum laude from the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, Germany, and has authored over 100 publications on international finance, economics, and trade. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Julius Cesar Morenas.
Thank you very much, Carlo, for the kind introduction. Greetings from Tokyo, and it's good to be back in the Philippines, if only virtually. Manila was the second to the last foreign trip I've made way back in January last year to attend a conference on my way to Australia. And since then, a lot of things have changed. I thought at first it would be a lot quieter and more relaxing as Japanese companies, including my own, started to encourage people to work from home and observe flexible working hours, and I don't have to fly anymore from one place to another to do my job. But boy, was I wrong. Once people got the hang of virtual meetings, which are cheap and easy to organize, there's just been an explosion. In my work, which is coordinating working groups engaged in APEC across 20 time zones from London to Santiago, that means having frequent late-night Zoom meetings up to 2 a.m. here in Japan, which is about the least inconvenient time for people from Europe, Asia, and the Americas to come together. So a lot of our waking hours have shifted, including mine, which is sleeping at 2 a.m. and waking up at 9 and having breakfast at 10. So I guess I'm enjoying the Southern Spanish lifestyle. And that has become my personal experience of our topic, which is working towards an integrated Asia-Pacific region. Can we go now to the next slide, please? So I'd like to divide my talk into 4 parts. First, why are we integrating? Or why are we trying to integrate? Second, what does it mean? Third, what are the challenges? And finally, what should we do? So to the first question. The push for regional integration has come from 2 sources. The first is from governments with the political objective of creating a more peaceful atmosphere to grow. The first iterations were established in the shadow of the Cold War in the 1950s, encouraged by the example of Europe. As the very few people here who were born before 1980 would remember, ASEAN was founded to provide a shelter for the Philippines and four other countries to protect themselves from the proxy wars that were being waged in the region by the US, China, and the then Soviet Union. Later on, as the Cold War was ending, APEC became a platform to incorporate former adversaries into a cooperative relationship. And so in APEC, we now have the US and its allies. We have Russia, we have China, we have Taiwan, which in APEC, which we call Chinese Taipei, and we have Hong Kong. And later on, they added Latin American members to complete the membership around the Pacific Rim. The other source of the push for integration has been business. This was spearheaded by multinational enterprises seeking greater access to markets through liberalization of trade and investment policies across the region. And later on, there has also been a growing push from newly emerging firms, including SMEs that are becoming increasingly integrated in global supply chains, which can benefit from lower costs and speedier processes through the facilitation of cross-border transactions, standardization, and interoperability of laws and regulations across jurisdictions. Over the years, the interests of governments and business have steadily converged as the process of globalization forced structural changes in developing economies. These structural changes have come in the form of a shift from traditional protectionism to a more embracing attitude toward cross-border trade in goods and services and investment, as the benefits of participating in global value chains for both businesses and economies have become more apparent. Regional frameworks have since become the main focus of integration efforts as WTO negotiations stalled after the launch of the Doha Round 20 years ago. And this has been reflected in the evolution of the ASEAN Free Trade Area to the ASEAN Economic Community, in the creation of wider integration frameworks like the RCEP and the CPTPP. And this was also reflected in the growing collaboration between governments and businesses in advancing various integration initiatives. For example, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, the creation of the APEC and ASEAN Business Advisory Councils, and the establishment of public-private collaboration platforms like the Asia-Pacific Financial Inclusion Forum, the Asia-Pacific Infrastructure Partnership, and the Asia-Pacific Financial Forum. Shall we go to the next slide then? The second question is, what does integration mean for economies and businesses? In the early years, efforts were focused on reducing barriers to trade in goods through reduction of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. That has progressed, and then came trade facilitation. This refers to improving procedures and controls governing cross-border movement of goods to reduce costs while safeguarding regulatory objectives. For example, by streamlining information requirements and border declaration forms, simplifying and harmonizing trade procedures. As more and more businesses came to operate across borders, the demand for a level playing field between foreign and domestic enterprises became more intense, and so competition policy and foreign exchange policy became a new focus of attention. With growing integration also came more intense competition for selling goods and services to local and overseas markets. And this means pressure to lower the costs of production and inputs, including power, raw and intermediate materials, and transportation, among others, to increase factor productivity, promote innovation, expand the pool of talent and expertise, develop quality infrastructure, and improve government services. It also means expanded access to loans, working capital, and risk financing for all enterprises participating in global value chains. And so it also became clear that in order to succeed in an integrated regional economy, structural reform is essential. This is now all taking place against the backdrop of digital transformation and the growing importance of sustainable environmental, social, and governance practices. Digital technology has been advancing rapidly during the past 2 decades, but its full utilization has been slowed by inertia in government, businesses, and among consumers themselves. That has changed a lot since COVID, and we have seen how in a space of less than a year, companies and agencies introduced flexible working practices, rapidly built up their digital systems and capabilities, migrated to virtual meetings, and introduced new management styles to adjust to these new realities. Consumers are also getting the hang of using digital technology in their everyday lives to meet their social interaction, grocery shopping, and other needs. One of the emerging agenda for regional integration today is how to prevent our region's fragmentation into digital islands that can make it more difficult to conduct business, which is increasingly becoming digital across borders. Many governments have been introducing legal, policy, and regulatory frameworks to promote the digital transformation of their economies while protecting consumers. And these include things like data privacy laws, open banking or open data frameworks, digital ID systems, credit information, and data sharing policies, among others. A lot of these efforts are internationally not coordinated or not sufficiently coordinated. So we face the prospects of different standards being adopted across jurisdictions. The concern about interoperability is growing, but efforts to promote this are still at very early stages. Another emerging issue is the fragmentation of approaches to promoting sustainability. In recent years, investors and lenders have increasingly come under pressure from shareholders, consumers, civil society, and regulators to channel capital away from activities and entities that do not comply with sustainable development goals to those that do. Governments are also under pressure to introduce measures to ensure that banks and capital markets operate in accordance with this objective. One example is current efforts to develop and adopt taxonomies for sustainable investment, which define, for example, what is green and what is brown as a basis for steering lending and investment activities toward sustainable development. The European Union has emerged as a leader in shaping global standards in this area, while the Asia-Pacific has remained fragmented and unable to influence this process. This is an important issue, especially for developing economies in the region that need large amounts of capital to build the infrastructure and businesses that they need to grow. They face serious challenges if the global standards that will be adopted are not flexible enough to take into consideration the sheer diversity of the region and their situation as economies in transition, or not dynamic enough to recognize the role that technology plays in transforming what is brown into something green in the future, or the other way around. In order for the region to continue attracting capital in the future, it is important to come together, develop interoperable or harmonized standards, and strengthen their collective voice in shaping global standards. So now let me go on to the next slide, which refers to the third question. What are the challenges that must be addressed in order to move forward? The history of recent decades have shown that regional integration is happening whether we like it or not. This is being accelerated by technology and the necessity to work together in order to continue along the path of growth and prosperity. But that same history has also shown that it is not easy for nations collectively to abandon what has worked in the past or the status quo that people are comfortable with, to take the risky leap into the unknown. There is always inertia that works against change, and this is something that permeates government and politics, businesses, and individual consumers. On the part of governments, there is that added difficulty of revising legal frameworks, which in most cases has to go through a long and complicated process of negotiations and education. Deep structural reforms also require not just piecemeal changes of one law or regulation, but an overhaul of several laws, policies, and regulations, in some cases at several levels of government, federal, state, local, to make sure that they are consistent and not conflicting, that they do not create confusion or additional compliance burdens and costs, and that they mutually reinforce each one's implementation. One example I often like to cite is the parallel introduction of privacy laws that impose huge fines and banks for unintended disclosure of customer information, while at the same time, also being introduced are open banking rules that force banks to share customer data with third-party service providers, as in the case of Europe with the GDPR and PSD2, or the Payment Services Directive. These changes require a lot of technical knowledge of how rules and regulations interact with each other, which is not often available to government officials in many developing countries, and a lot of effort to educate decision makers. On the part of businesses, there is a similar inertia that comes from various factors, such as cost considerations and risks of migrating to new systems, the potential impact of changes on employees and other stakeholders, and cultural traditions, among others. In many companies in China and Japan, for example, a lot of processes are still paper-based because approval requires the use of chops. There is also the issue of outdated legal and regulatory requirements. For example, in the case of trade finance, where in various cases, electronic documents are not recognized by law, so that in documentary trade finance, which is mostly used by SMEs, procedures are still paper-based and manual, in spite of the availability of technology that can actually automate and digitize the whole process. And then on the part of consumers, there is the lack of familiarity with new technologies and concerns about risks in using them. In Japan, which is one of the most technologically advanced countries, for example, most people are still using cash because ATMs are everywhere and so convenient and people are just used to them. The government is trying to encourage people to migrate to digital payments, including in the payment of utilities bills, but many people are wary of risks from their digital information being hacked and stolen. An even bigger challenge is cross-border interoperability. Due to the global nature of business, new laws, regulations, systems, and practices should be developed and introduced in a way that enables cross-border transactions to be more efficient and less costly instead of the other way around. Agreement and common standards is important, and this involves a wide variety of standards that are essential to the functioning of various transactions, from trade finance to digital identity to electronic KYC, just to cite a few. While COVID has caused a lot of suffering around the world, it also had a silver lining, which is that it has forced a change of mindset and resulted in many important changes in the way we do things that take advantage of innovations and new technologies. So this is a nice point to try to answer the last question, which is, what should we do to move ahead? There are obviously a lot of things that Asia-Pacific regional platforms can help us with, as we are entering a new era similar to what the world has gone through during the Industrial Revolution. But I would summarize them in 3 C's: collaboration, coordination, and capacity building. First, we need collaboration across government agencies and levels in order to provide the holistic whole-of-government responses to legal, policy, regulatory, and institutional reforms. We need collaboration among government, business, academia, and civil society, because a lot of the innovations that are key to successful reforms are originating from outside the government, especially from the private sector. And most importantly, we need to leverage the platforms for collaboration that regional organizations like APEC and ASEAN offer to collaborate in finding solutions to regional challenges. Second, we need coordination to ensure the interoperability of systems across the region. The work of regional organizations like APEC and ASEAN in coordinating rules that affect trade has been going on for years and is quite advanced. But the work to ensure interoperability in the area of digital transformation and the financing of transition to more sustainable business and organizational practices, it's still at early stages and needs to be more rapidly developed. And finally, we need capacity building. The world we are evolving into is complex and requires a lot of technical expertise, as well as a lot of learning from actual experiences in the real world. Bringing together experts, practitioners, and decision makers is important for sharing perspectives, best practices, and lessons from successes and failures. This is critical for the success of developing economies in the region, which are likely to become the future engines of growth for the Asia Pacific and for the world. So collaboration, coordination, and capacity building, this I think is the way forward. And with this, let me conclude my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Parrenas. While waiting for our other panelists, allow me to introduce Attorney Eusebio Tan, who will facilitate the open forum. Attorney Tan serves as off-counsel at Accra Law. He focuses his practice on the areas of investment, namely business law, mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, franchises and franchising, construction law, leases and leasing, banks and banking, and public-private partnerships and privatization projects. He has represented international and domestic banks and various corporations in major loan transactions. He acts as a member of the board and or as an officer, including in certain cases as corporate secretary of several large corporations. He led teams that obtained full banking licenses for major foreign banks under the Foreign Banks Liberalization Law of the Philippines, or RA 7721. He was also recently involved in the drafting of Republic Act number 10641, which allowed the full entry of foreign banks into the Philippines. He obtained his Bachelor of Laws degree from the Ateneo de Manila University School of Law in 1975, where he was awarded the second honors silver medal. He obtained his Master's of Law degree from the Columbia University School of Law in 1979. Attorney Tan, the floor is yours. And may I likewise call back Mr. Camacho and Dr. Parrenas to join the panel discussion, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Carl. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Hello? Okay. Is Prime Minister Helen Clark already with us? Not yet.
Not at the moment. I'll let you know when she's in the call.
Okay. Can you please, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Carlo. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Carlo, for the introduction. I'd like to thank, Bambang Susantono, who presented his paper to us from Manila, the head offices of the ADB. Lito Camacho was calling in from Singapore. J.C. Parrenas was calling in from Tokyo. And pretty soon, we will have former Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Helen Clark, calling in from Auckland. So this is the international section of our annual conference of FINEX this year. Perhaps I can throw the first question to Lito. You shared with us very interesting and stimulating opinions with respect to regional integration. I'm particularly struck with the I agree. There are domestic politics scenarios of extreme nationalism, populism, inward-looking policies that exist right now within the region and and throughout the world. What do you think can be done, if any,
We're losing your audio.
to at least soften that scenario, regional? Yeah, sorry, Alito, I'll repeat. What do you think can be done or should be done, if anything can be done, to soften the domestic politics scenario
Okay.
existing in the region? And
But if I may, and I think I understand your question. No? Your question is what can be done to reverse perhaps the direction of this kind of policy making that we're seeing around the world. I'm afraid to say, that this is really driven by politicians, and politicians are driven by their political interests. So if it is popular, and if it will get them elected or keep them in power, they will do it. No, as was the case, for the period of, I guess from the 80s through the 90s, early part of the 21st century, when in fact the world prospered because of globalization and free trade. And we saw that even in the Philippines. I remember FVR and these reforms in the 90s, no? And that was very popular. In fact, we had an opportunity, and there were thoughts about extending his term, notwithstanding the constitutional challenges, because people were enjoying the benefits of globalization and free trade. That's very much true even in China. No? But the world has changed, and it's hard to say whether it's the widening of disparity between the rich and the poor, because in the prosperity that was created, it was kind of skewed. No, the rich people got very much richer. Poor people got a little bit better off, but the discrepancy was very wide. And I think that provided for very ingenious politicians who saw that gap and spoke to that anger, that anger in the streets by speaking very vocally about populism and things like that. And look, in our own country in 2016, I think our president was elected because people were fed up with the peace and order situation that we had. And when this president spoke, then the candidate spoke very, very boldly and very strongly about it. We got him elected, and he was very popular. So I think that's the kind of politics that we are living with. It's really driven by anger, anger in the streets, whether it's whatever the source of frustration is, and that's what politicians will speak to. So I can't really say that there's a remedy to this, this direction in world politics or domestic politics. I'm afraid, as I said, I cannot see any candidate in any country in Asia going on a platform of regional integration and expecting to win. That would be unrealistic.
Well, even in the States, Lito, I recall when Trump ran, he had very nationalistic positions in his campaign, and I guess it won him the presidency.
It resonated. It resonated with lots and lots of people.
Yeah. Another question to you. You mentioned India, and I agree with you also. It's a growing giant. So how do you think is best? How best to integrate India into the Asian region?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think first of all, it's hard to integrate India unless India has the confidence that it has achieved. It's gotten there, no? And I think
when is the secretary certificate?
There's an. I'm sorry, Ebot, that I can hear someone else talking.
Go ahead, Lito.
Yeah. Okay.
Ebot was able to go on.
Yeah. No. Anyway, India, no. I think it's hard to integrate India without India looking for that, to engage with the rest of the region. So, and it's hard to do that if it does not have the confidence that it's economically strong and can compete with the rest of the region. As I mentioned, India has suffered from its, by the way, this is a personal view, not a Credit Suisse view, very personal. I believe that India has suffered from dysfunctional political system that they've had, where there are states that are more powerful than the federal government, that can stall many good reforms that many governments in India have tried, particularly on the side of liberalization. India has also suffered from its legacy of protectionism. I mean, let's not forget, in the 60s and the 70s, India was almost like a satellite of the Soviet Union. And therefore, a lot of the big businesses in India prospered because of entitlements, licenses, and the like. And the spirit of entrepreneurship was not as strong. I think that's changing because of its young population, but more important, the contribution of technology. Because I think with its IT savvy population, you're seeing a lot more entrepreneurs, particularly on the tech side. And I think that's democratizing the economy of India. I think when that comes, when India gains that confidence, I think India will want to engage. Because when you look at the big trading blocks, India is not very prominent. Like RCEP, for example, it would have been the perfect platform where you have almost all of East Asia, including Asia, including the Pacific, the Australasia nations of Australia and New Zealand. And if we could get the India subcontinent economies into that, you pretty much have what is an integrated Asia Pacific trading bloc. So I think it will be good for everyone, because India, I believe, will become one of the biggest economies. It's the 7th largest, but it's 2nd largest population. So if it achieves that potential of being top 3, I think the rest of the region and India would get a lot of benefits from being more engaged with the Asia Pacific.
Attorney Tan, if I may interrupt, I'd like to welcome our other panelist.
Yes, please.
Yes. Joining us this afternoon in this open forum is the Right Honorable Helen Clark. She is a respected global leader on sustainable development, gender equality, and international cooperation. She served 3 successive terms as Prime Minister of New Zealand between 1999 and 2008. While in government, she led policy debate on a wide range of economic, social, environmental, and cultural issues, including sustainability and climate change. She then became the United Nations Development Program Administrator for 2 terms from 2009 to 2017 as the first woman to lead the organization. She was also the chair of the United Nations Development Group, a committee consisting of the heads of all UN funds, programs, and departments working on developmental issues. In 2009, Helen Clark became the patron of the Helen Clark Foundation. Welcome, Honorable Helen Clark.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone from New Zealand.
Good evening, Madam Prime Minister. Thank you so much for this this evening, your time. I know it's 5 hours ahead. Invite you. Do you have any preliminary remarks you want to share with us on the topic of regional integration?
Well, I mean, just an opening comment, having looked at some of the directions the conversation might take. In the 9 years I was New Zealand Prime Minister, pursuing free trade agreements around the region was something I was very involved in. We started a lot of talks. We concluded some, and others were concluded by subsequent governments. New Zealand was also with Singapore, Brunei, and Chile, the forward-leaning countries which negotiated the original Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And then that grew and grew to what we know today as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Pacific region. When I was at APEC, I guess there was always a desire that perhaps the APEC countries might develop an FTA, but that wasn't easy. As it was, we got on and did the agreements with whoever was prepared to engage. That, of course, included ASEAN, it included China, it included Korea, eventually included Hong Kong and Malaysia. So, New Zealand has been the beneficiary of, wide-ranging regional economic integration in the Asia Pacific. And obviously, with that perspective, I would like to see what has become this comprehensive and progressive agreement able to bring in more countries and be even more inclusive over time. One of the big issues will be whether the United States ever comes back in. Barack Obama wanted it in, Donald Trump didn't. We don't really have a clear view from the current administration. But I'm of the view that the open trade is a good thing. It certainly served New Zealand well. If we look at the countries around our region which have prospered, the more open they are, the more they've prospered. And I think there are some lessons in that.
Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. While you're here, I wonder if you've listened to the presentations of our two previous speakers. One very interesting view presented earlier is that it's difficult at this time for countries within this region to really get into integration because of the geopolitics and the domestic politics scenario, which involves nationalism, populism, inward-looking policies. Would you have any comment with respect to that observation?
Yes, I think that geopolitical environment has certainly deteriorated since I was Prime Minister. I went to 8 APEC summits, for example, and sitting there as the Prime Minister of a very small country, alongside the leaders of very large countries, from the US to China to Japan, and so on. But it was possible in those days I was attending, 2000 to 2007, to talk about economics and trade and a wide range of trade-related issues without acrimony. The whole context of the debate now has changed so much between particularly the two largest economies in APEC. And I guess what I would like to see this broader Asia-Pacific region get back to is to being able to, if you like, compartmentalize issues. We live in a highly diverse region, diverse in terms of ethnicity, faith, political system. You think of, some attribute of a country, we've got them all in the region. So there's no point us thinking we can just work alongside and trade with those who happen to share our particular worldview. That's a road to nowhere. We have to use diplomacy to be able to say we need to talk trade, we need to talk climate crisis, we need to talk pandemic management, we need to talk all sorts of things through as a region. And the extent to which we can depoliticize these issues is very positive for our region. But if we get stuck on the geopolitics roadblock the first time we start a discussion, we're just not going to go anywhere. This is a dynamic region, but its dynamism will be blunted if it can't work as a region in trade and economic and other terms.
I see. Okay, thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. JC, do you have any comments with respect to the points raised by both Lito and Madam Prime Minister?
Yes, I think, of course, I fully agree with Lito about his observations on the geopolitical issues that are creating division within the region. And Madam Clark's observation that this has intensified in recent years. I also have been involved in APEC since 1996, and I have seen that change in the dynamics. However, I think we also need to keep in mind that there are several processes in parallel going on in the relationships among countries. I see that, for example, in the work we're doing in China. China is not a monolithic country, actually. when it comes to certain issues, like for example, in our what we're pushing to implement, which was one of the initiatives of the APEC finance ministers, is to to promote more access to finance for SMEs. This, for example, requires the sharing of data that fintech companies and technology companies can use in order to to provide more access to finance for SMEs. But there are other groups in China that would like to keep data and to keep data within their domestic jurisdiction. While there are a lot of Chinese businesses that are expanding in the region, and they have a different view on that. There are also differences in views among the Chinese agencies. So, for example, the People's Bank of China is more liberal because they're pushing for financial inclusion, but the Public Security Bureau has another view. So I think what is happening now is that we need to engage countries in areas where we can collaborate. We need to identify those institutions who are really supporting the process of regional integration. This is I think one of the benefits of regional groups like APEC, because APEC is focused on economics. It's focused on issues like inclusion, sustainability, creating more opportunities for small, medium enterprises. And we can find a lot of institutions in China and in other countries in the Asia Pacific who agree with these objectives. And I think by working together with these institutions, we strengthen the role of regional integration and the standing of regional integration within domestic economies.
Thank you, JC. Well, China is certainly a giant, and it's growing bigger and bigger as the days go by. They've got a lot of financial muscle. They've got a lot of technical expertise, and their developments are, AI and everything. To the point of Lito also, how do you, and I'd like to hear also from Madam Prime Minister, feel about eventually, I guess, China will have to take a lead role in any efforts to integrate within the Asia Pacific region. Maybe Lito, can you go ahead and expound on your
Ebot, I've already said what I want to say about China. It is probably one of the biggest dilemmas for the rest of the region. I mean, because China will support integration, but with its very special role, as being the leader of that integration. They, like for RCEP, for example, I expect that China will be dominant in writing the trade rules that will provide a framework for RCEP. Will the rest of the region be able to accept that? Will Japan be able to accept that? Would Korea, the rest of ASEAN, etc. And will we continue to look at the US to provide that counterbalance, which can be very destabilizing, because I think by itself that US-China conflict is very destabilizing, especially in integrating Asia, because we're being, as I've mentioned, we're being asked to take sides, and it's very cruel, for economies like Singapore and the Philippines to feel like they have to choose sides, and because both superpowers can be quite punitive, and I think we saw that in the experience of Australia when they made some comments around the Uyghurs in China, together with Europe and the US, and the Korea when China shut down tourism into Korea. They're very quick in their responses. So, the question of China is, can we accept? I think we can easily more accept if China started showing a little bit more diplomacy, right, and less of the unilateral tactics, bully tactics that they have been using, particularly in the South China Seas, and the Philippines is a big recipient of that. The aggressive positioning of China, and then more recently, you've seen it. We're seeing it in Taiwan too. I mean, just the number of the number of Air Force incursions into the what the Taiwanese would consider to be their space. That seems to be increasing. So how that's why I say to me that's the biggest dilemma. How do we, while we recognize, and we should all recognize, that China has arrived, it will be the biggest economy in the world. There's no turning that clock, turning back that clock. How do we create I guess a relationship that is more constructive, no? And it requires changes on both sides. I think both on the China side and the rest of the region. For the rest of the region, it's accepting, recognizing the dominance of China, and for China to understand that they've arrived. They don't have to live through this century of humiliation and feel like they're still in that era, right? I mean, they're now a world leader. They can be more magnanimous. They can be more, they can be more constructive, no, and be more open.
Yeah, wise words. There's an old saying that no great power has ever emerged on the block without considerable disruption, and I guess we're seeing that disruption today.
Yes.
And I suppose for the region, the region doesn't want to be forced to choose between the US and China, because both are extremely important countries. China is a huge market, and also the US is a huge source of technology and goods and services that people want to buy. So you don't want to be forced to choose, and that's why I emphasized earlier that the importance of diplomacy. We have to be able to find a way as a region of relating across the geopolitical and other differences to focus on what's in the shared interests of all of us. When I was Prime Minister, we entered free trade agreement negotiations with China, and I remember when my trade minister came to our cabinet and put this proposal to us, our first reaction was, "Are you mad? A country of 4.5 million wanting to enter a free trade agreement with China." And he sort of went through the case, and in the end we said, "Well, it looks interesting." Now I have to say that that was signed in early 2008. Just as the global financial crisis was having such a dramatic impact on economies around the world. And that agreement and the access to the Chinese market was one of the factors which enabled New Zealand to come through the global financial crisis without anything like the sort of damage that you saw a lot of other economies at all levels of development come through. So an open trading relationship with China has been good for us. Now, we've always wanted the same with the United States, and had Barack Obama's policy of staying on board with the Trans-Pacific Partnership continued, of course, we would have had access to that market through there, and that, of course, wasn't to be with the change in presidency. But I think you'll always hear from New Zealand a voice for, let's work on this regional integration. It's in the interests of all of us. We're in a region where there's roughly 60% at least of the global economy. It's a very powerful region in economic terms, and can be even more powerful if it works together rather than being ripped apart by the politics.
Ebot, you're on mute.
Sorry. Okay. Madam Prime Minister, with your 9 years of experience as Prime Minister and 8 years of experience as Administrator of the UNDP, would you know what particular ways this diplomacy steps could be taken to get China to be a little softer with everybody else in the region?
Well, I mean, it is a much more assertive China, and that's often expressed through what are called the wolf warrior diplomats, who aren't that diplomatic, actually. So when you combine the wolf warriors with the former President Trump's diplomacy through tweets, it was a recipe for disaster, really, because people were, knocking right past each other. Now, I suppose all eyes are on whether the current US administration can develop a new way of dealing with China, of relating to China. I think whenever China feels that people are ganging up against it, it will react to that, and that's one of the reasons that I personally have concerns about this new Australia, UK, USA defence agreement, because it looks like it's a yet another kind of let's contain China agreement, and you're not going to quote contain China in those terms. You need to engage China, and if I look back, over the New Zealand relationship with China, here we are, a high-income country, incredibly deeply democratic country, but our position has been for some half century that China must be engaged with. China must be brought into the great agreements and institutions. We were the first country to negotiate the bilateral accession agreement for China coming into the WTO. We were the first to recognise its market economy status as a Western economy. We were the first Western economy to enter free trade negotiations. So, our track record has been try to engage, and that's really the advice I'd give all leaders. Engagement rather than containment, I think. So, and then if you're clear about what your diplomacy and your strategy is, you can still obviously say the things that your publics will demand that you say. If there are human rights abuses, which there often are, I've had to speak on those as New Zealand Prime Minister with respect to China, but you're trying to build a relationship where you can register a disagreement, but without that disagreement poisoning every other interaction that you have to have. Now, as I say, the engagement goes well beyond our trade and economic interests. If China is not a full participant in climate action, we really are doomed in trying to reach the Paris Agreement. China and pandemics. I think to make progress on getting our world better prepared for the next time a pandemic threat emerges, China will have to be on board. We really need a new treaty. We need new institutions. China has to be part of that. So I'm very much, and I guess this reflects a small country, no power at all, in the sense of hard power perspective. I'm very much for diplomatic engagement and trying to sort these issues through.
But if I may
Yes.
just interject, because
Go ahead,
something that
please.
the former Prime Minister said earlier resonated with me, and that's the idea of compartmentalizing the issues, because there are really many arenas when we talk about geopolitical relationships, and that's true with China. And but I'm sure there are many items in that list of agenda that where our interests would be aligned and very common. I mean, take climate change, for example, and I think that's one area where perhaps China has even been more aggressive than many other big economies. The way they've been redirecting their source of energy, promoting renewable energy and trying to control or limit the number of coal plants in China and so on and so forth. That's probably an area that would get China to be much more engaged with the rest of the region. I think health issues and this experience with the pandemic, I think is a good avenue for engaging with China. You can't do it by pointing the fingers at them as the source of the virus. I mean, that was, as the Prime Minister said, you don't, a giant like China that has lived through 2 centuries of humiliation, you will only provoke them if you start, making those smart remarks, smart alecky remarks about, Chinese virus, etc. And I think and the more engagement the world and the region can have with China, I think the better opportunity we will have on the more difficult issues like trade, like security, and so on. So the more we meet with each other, I think the more opportunities we have for diplomacy to take place. When you get the, for example, the phone call, that I think 1.5 hour phone call between Biden and President Xi. I think that's a remarkable event, considering how it was when it was still President Trump. And I think you start seeing a softening, right? And the decibels have decreased. You start seeing sound bites coming from Washington about perhaps slowly unwinding some of the tariffs. So that's good. Those are all favorable comments that I think will encourage more engagement from both sides, China. But there is one alarming thing that's happening in China that worries me, though, in what we're talking about. And it's China seemingly changing their economic strategy. For decades, it's been driven by trade, driven by investments, and that's how they've grown 10, 11% per annum. In more recent years, and in the recent pronouncements of the president, the Chinese president, it's going to be not only domestic consumption, domestic economy, but the domestic economy that will be supplied domestically. The notion that China can be the biggest market in the world, competing with the US as it has been for decades, it's not as clear to me now. If China starts becoming more reliant on their domestic manufacturing, domestic suppliers to provide for the growth in domestic demand, what will it be for the rest of the world, particularly Asia, particularly Southeast Asia? I'm sure they will not be able to supply their own tropical fruits because they're not, they don't have tropical places where they can grow mangoes and papayas. But for manufacturing, for industrial goods, for equipment, for technology, if China became more self-reliant, I'm not sure if that's good for integration in the region.
Yeah, I agree completely. And perhaps that's the right strategy to take. Take some small steps, and eventually we cover a lot of ground in terms of, peaceful coexistence with a giant like China. Yeah. JC, do you have any comments on this topic?
Yes. Well, it's really fascinating because we always have this step back, step forward developments, and we've seen that, and it's been mentioned by Lito. Step back, China trying to become more autarkic in its industry, but at the same time, as Lito had said, China is also engaging a lot in the area of sustainability. Next week, actually, we have been requested, the Asia-Pacific Financial Forum has been requested by China to hold a big symposium. It's a hybrid event in Beijing, and it's focused on digitalization and sustainability. China has reached out to us to provide advice, for example, on how to develop its carbon markets. As you know, China established the carbon market registry in Wuhan last July, and also the carbon market, the carbon trading center in Shanghai. So these are the two pillars of China's carbon market development strategy, and they have been actually asking for advice, and we're organizing this event to bring in international experts to share experiences and also to provide perspective. How do you really develop an efficient carbon market? So I think this is really an example of looking for a space where we can engage China, where they are also interested in engaging with the world. And if we expand this space, then we develop a more cooperative relationship with China, so that it can overshadow the areas where we compete on uncertain fronts.
Thank you, JC. By the way, on another topic, I recall that we were communicating earlier. You had some ideas on how to expand the participation of SMEs in regional trade. Would you like to share that with us?
Well, a lot of SMEs have a lot of potential, and everybody knows that they're the largest provider of employment in every economy. But the thing is, legal and policy and regulatory structures are biased against SMEs because they tend to increase the costs, make financing, for example, unavailable for SMEs. And this has to change. Just to give you one example, which I mentioned earlier in trade finance. Problem of SMEs is access to working capital. And the thing is, the letters of credit, which SMEs normally use in trade finance, this is still paper-based and manual, which means it's very costly, it's very slow, it's very inefficient. We have the technology actually to automate this, to digitize these processes. But the thing is, there are different legal frameworks that prevent, the recognition and use of electronic documents across borders. So you can't do that. We have different standards for documents, which make it very difficult to automate, to standardize documents and automate them. So technology is there, but banks cannot apply them because of regulatory and legal barriers. These are the types of things, for example, that we are working on in APEC. And that's why, regional cooperation is very important in resolving these issues to enable the SMEs and to empower them to participate more actively in regional trade and investment.
Okay, Lito, would you have any views on this question?
Well, I think that's another area of opportunity. When we were talking about China, I think finance and capital markets is probably one area where you could probably see an alignment of interest as well. I mean, China today already represents one of the biggest capital markets in the world, but it's a very domestic capital market. The potential of opening up China to regional issuers, for example, in Shanghai or Shenzhen stock exchanges can be quite powerful in encouraging this kind of collaboration and cooperation and engagement with China. Because I think the more Chinese investors start having economic interest in the rest of the region and vice versa, the friendship and cooperation will be easier in the future. So I think we should really take advantage of all these avenues or arenas. And I think what JC described in the area of SMEs, and then I would expand that to include all levels of financing, not just for SMEs, but even for large corporations, going so that capital can flow in and out of China into the rest of the region and vice versa. I think an interesting development here, if I may just add something to the pot, is the China developing this digital currency and how that might impact the development of finance in the region. If will a digital renminbi become more acceptable as a regional currency that we can use for trade, for finance, etc. And as I said, in my fantasy, a world that's not dominated by the US dollar can be quite stabilizing. If a digital renminbi became much more acceptable and used around the region, I think those are steps that can promote, this kind of cooperation that we're talking about within the region.
Thank you, Lito. By the way, it's been said, I think earlier, or I've read that in entering into regional trade agreements, not all parties, of course, will benefit as much. Of course, some countries will benefit more than others, just because of their comparative advantage. My question, and I'd like to raise it first to Madam Prime Minister, then ask each of the other panelists. Would you think that entering into a bilateral trade or investment agreement would be more beneficial for any country versus a regional agreement? Madam Prime Minister, can I get your views first?
Well, a regional agreement is much more attractive because otherwise you've got such a spaghetti bowl of agreements, and there is a spaghetti bowl around our region now of different bilateral, sub-regional, etc. It becomes very confusing, and a lot of compliance costs for businesses trying to work out which particular provision of which trade agreement applies to which country, and you have to do different things for country A as opposed to country B next door. So it's like the need to have a good WTO agreement. You need a good regional agreement so that there's a common set of rules. I think it's as simple as that, and that's why we should hang out in the region for a truly comprehensive regional economic and trade partnership, and not really settle for those which exclude one side or another, or don't let small economies in, and so on. Look, given how the Asia Pacific has prospered through trade, really it should be leading on trade, including at WTO, which has been stuck for years, as we know. I mean, there's a very sad anniversary coming up at the end of this year, and it's the 20th anniversary of the launch of the Doha development round, which is never concluded. And that really should be a cause for huge concern. It should be dominating the APEC Leaders Summit. But my experience at APEC Leaders Summits over the years was there was always a communique which said, we give our full support to completion of the Doha round, and then the diplomats went off and of course did anything but give their full support. So time, I think, for leaders to say what they mean and mean what they say, that we need a decent WTO round, and we need some action regionally on a truly inclusive trade pact.
Thank you, Madam Prime Minister. JC, I'd like to turn to you, because when you had a slide earlier of the world, probably, and it had a lot of circles, and going to what Madam Prime Minister is mentioning, it does look confusing. What do you think about this question about bilateral versus regional? JC,
Yes,
can I hear you?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with Madam Clark. For businesses, having to deal with different arrangements with different countries is very costly. Different rules of origin, for example, and that's especially very, very difficult for SMEs. I mean, multinational companies can deal with that because they can have the staff and the money, but SMEs, you need to lower the costs for them. So it's very bad. And in APEC, we've always had this this work that of course we recognize that there are countries that have bilateral arrangements, but we try to develop standards so that they are not that different from each other. But again, the ideal really is the global framework, which is why the WTO is really what we would like to see. But as Madam Clark had said, every year in APEC we've been saying, please, please leaders, work to conclude the WTO Doha round, but that has never happened, and that's why absent that development of the WTO, regional arrangements have become the focus of attention. But again, as we've seen, there are several overlapping regional arrangements in the region, and what we must try to do now is to make them interoperable with each other.
Thank you, JC. Lito, any?
Well, I think I made those my comments.
You want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I made my comments in my earlier remarks, but
Paper.
I would echo and I would support what Prime Minister Clark has mentioned. The spaghetti bowl of bilaterals, multilaterals, sub-regionals, regionals. To be honest, even for somebody like me who worked in government, I was finance minister, and I worked on some of those agreements, I find it very confusing. And I think in this spaghetti bowl, only big money wins. because they have the resources, as JC mentioned. They have the army of lawyers, army of trade negotiators, that can look at the arbitrage opportunities in these various agreements. The losers is really the real economy, the main economy, the SMEs and the poor people in our respective countries, because they're not able to take advantage of those bilaterals and multilaterals. So I think that in the ideal world, we should really work with one platform, but that's not realistic. So, as a realistic objective, maybe a regional platform. I think I like RCEP. I think that I like the RCEP platform. I think if we can, as I said, if we can expand that to include the India subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc., then I think we have the makings of a truly integrated Asia-Pacific, from a trade sense. Where you've got tariffs down to zero for most products and hopefully services too. I think that one can make it really make the region really very powerful and supercharged, to be able to grow and work off each other's strengths. I really hope RCEP will work. In fact, Ebot, if I may, I actually would like to take advantage of the presence of the former Prime Minister, because I'd like to hear her wise, view on the question that you asked me. How can we engage India? Because India is the sleeping giant, but when India wakes up, it will become it will have an important role. But right now, India is not part of RCEP. India is not part of the CPTPP. What would be the best way to engage India? Because I think those groundworks will have to start already, so that at the appropriate time, RCEP has a 20-year time frame. Hopefully by then, India is already an active partner.
Yeah, and if RCEP involves or includes India, it'll cover, as you said, 50% of the population of the world. Yes. Madam Prime Minister, can we ask you to share your views on that? How to best be able to engage India?
Well, I agree. It's critical to be inclusive, and there would be benefits for India and benefits for the region in including it. India still retains quite a lot of protection, and that denies its citizens the access to goods and services at the best prices. Conversely, it is a great centre for manufacturing of many kinds, and could benefit from much more open market access in our region. I think if I think back to my days as Prime Minister, which are a while ago now, but when we talked Asia Pacific, we were very focused on the Asia Pacific rim, on ASEAN, on North Asia, and then of course the seaboard countries of the Americas. And we were probably a bit late to the party in recognizing that we needed to direct a lot more attention towards India, and maybe the same is still true of a lot of our region, that we need to be seeing India as an indispensable partner. Now, of course, that may also raise some issues with China. I recall when China came into what began as the East Asia Forum, which grew out of the ASEAN Plus arrangements. You had your ASEAN Plus 3, which was China, Japan, Korea, and you had ASEAN Plus 2, which was New Zealand, Australia, and then East Asia Forum, as it began in my time as Prime Minister, joined that up with India and with Russia. And there was a bit of an attitude in China at that time of, why did you let the cat into the chicken coop, as it were. I think was the phrase. But just as we call diplomacy and dialogue between the US and China, we need diplomacy and dialogue between these two huge Asian countries, India and China, who of course share a border, which makes it all the more important that there are peaceful peaceful and harmonious relationship, shall we say, and many shared interests in the region. You know, it's in neither China nor India's interest for Myanmar to be in the turmoil that it's in at the present time, for example. So I would say a diplomatic toolbox that India would be, you know, an asset in any regional and inclusive agreement, and that, you know, diplomacy should work towards that.
Yeah, and India has all the ingredients. I think the young population, the people who can learn quickly, tech savvy, etc., and huge population, good domestic market, and they can export probably anything, even high tech goods. JC, you want to say anything on that on India?
Yeah, I remember when I attended one of these CEO summits, probably maybe about 10 years ago, we had a survey of the CEOs who were there, and said, which country would you want to join APEC? And about 70% said India. So, you know, from the business sector side, you know, we really believe that it makes a lot of sense for India to join APEC. The issue there, I think, is twofold. One is the political issue, especially with regard to China's agreement to get India to join APEC. But the other is, and it has also been mentioned within India itself, that they need to do a lot of work in order to be able to sort of qualify as you know, equivalent to the other APEC member economies, and to, you know, so that when they join APEC, it's not just India benefiting, but it's a mutual benefit from among members. And so far, they have not been, you know, they have not been able to undertake those reforms that need to be done. So I think we need to play a waiting game, but in the meantime, I think that the way is to engage India in promoting the reforms and encouraging them to, you know, to be more open to the world.
JC, I have another question to Madam Prime Minister. This efforts to get regional integration going should not only be the responsibility of government. I'd like to hear your views, Madam Prime Minister, on how to promote more collaboration between the public sector and the private sector to advance regional integration. Then I'd like to go around the table and ask each one of you to also weigh in. Madam Prime Minister, could you give us your views?
Well, I think the support of the business sector around the region is very important for driving this, because I'm sure New Zealand's not the only country which has quite an active sort of anti-trade lobby. Believe it or not, we make our living by trade, but we have an anti-trade lobby. But we're not alone in that, and you know, you need supporters for doing these agreements, because when you do a trade agreement, you don't get everything you want. You'll never get an agreement if you only, you know, are prepared to settle for what you want and not have a bit of give and take. So having informed business constituencies which understand that and understand the broader benefits of the regional economic agreements, I think is very, very important. So I can only encourage the business sector to step up through its, you know, various national organisations, industry sectors, you know, regional organisations, APEC Business Advisory Council, APEC CEO Forum, and so on. It was also a disappointment to me over the years how few New Zealand business people engaged with the APEC CEO Forum. It was a pretty small set. So I think we need to raise the sights of our business people to see, you know, how important this broader integration is.
Thank you, Madam Prime Minister. Lito, would you like to say something about that?
Well, I think the role of the private sector and business community in particular is critical to promote the agenda of integration, economic integration, primarily for two reasons. Right? One, I think the interest of political leaders tends to be shorter term than business leaders. Right? You know, you, as a business leader or shareholders, you're more likely to be with a company for a long time, right? Political leaders have to worry about elections for most countries, not all countries, but they have to worry about elections. So their interest can change depending on the wind of political wind, you know, that's blowing. So I think it's very important that business leaders take an active role in these regional discussions, negotiations, because it's in their long-term interest. I think another important role of business leaders, which is to help political leaders sell the regional agenda domestically. You know, one of the problems I experienced when I was in government and being involved in these conversations is that it's heightened when we meet at the regional level with fellow colleagues, you know, among ministers, you know, leaders, etc. Once you get back home, the agenda changes, right? Because there are, you know, more pressing and sometimes conflicting agenda domestically. I think this is where business leaders can play an important role in the PR or communication of the regional agenda to the domestic audience. Why is it beneficial to the Philippines and to Filipinos and to Filipino business that we play an active role in RCEP or, you know, ASEAN or whatever the regional initiative might be? You know, it's very difficult to just rely on the political leader because at that particular time, it may not be to his or her political advantage. But to the business leaders, the business people, it will always be in their interest. So I think they have to play that role.
Thank you, Rito. JC, my way in?
Yeah, well, I think APEC is very unique among international organizations because it's the only international organization where business has been given a role, a big role. The APEC Business Advisory Council has an annual dialogue with the APEC leaders, and APEC has a seat in all of the APEC fora. So I've been involved in the finance ministers process. So I sit in the finance ministers and officials meeting. I participate in the drafting of joint statements, and we work together with finance ministries. So this is something that you cannot find anywhere else. It's not in the G20 has B20, but they don't have this deep interaction. ASEAN Business Advisory Council also does not have this deep interaction with ASEAN leaders as we do have in APEC. The other thing is, I think the finance ministers have been very practical because, we've been discussing a lot of these issues for many years, like how do we promote private sector in investment in infrastructure. This has been discussed since like 1994, 1995, when the finance ministers first met. But I think at a certain point, they realized that, we just keep on discussing the same thing. We come to the same conclusion, but nothing happens. And so what the finance ministers did, and which is, something that the APEC Business Advisory Council suggested to them was, why don't we set up a platform where we can collaborate, private sector, public sector, multilateral organizations, to actually help implement what the finance ministers have already endorsed. And they agreed, they established the APEC Asia-Pacific Financial Forum in 2013. And this forum has helped many economies actually implement what the finance ministers have endorsed in the Cebu Action Plan, including the Philippines. Like the new secured transactions law that was passed in the Philippines, which was in the Cebu Action Plan, was passed because of the help that we provided through this platform. We brought in international experts, brought in the World Bank, and the Philippines didn't have to pay for them because these people were being paid by their own by their own institutions to do this. We sent people to the Senate, to attend the hearings and to talk about why it's important to pass this bill. And this bill was passed unanimously by the Senate in record time, 2 years, which is, record time for the Philippines. We also helped Brunei. In the case of Brunei, it was easy because the central bank said, why don't you help us draft the law? So we sent somebody to draft the law, helped them do it. They gave it to the Sultan, he signed, and it was law. So this is the kind of work that we're doing, not just in SME finance, but in other things. We have about 500 experts from industry associations, multilateral organizations, even regulatory agencies, from about 200 institutions working on different parts of the financial sector. I think you also know, because we held a conference with FINEX earlier this year, and you made a report about it.
Thank you, JC. Again, I'd like to ask everyone, don't you think that this pandemic, with all its adverse effects to everybody, this should be an argument for all countries in the world to try to get together and integrate, especially for trade, etc. Okay, while I have you there on my screen, JC, why don't you start?
Well, definitely. I think it has been a wake-up call, and a lot of because of the need to go digital, the need for contactless interactions. A lot of regulators have really woken up, because these are a lot of things that we have been, from the business sector side, we have been recommending that you need to change these laws and regulations to facilitate digital transactions. But the response has been slow. But after COVID, all of a sudden, they have actually said, we want to do this. We want to develop open banking or open data frameworks. Can you help us? So all of a sudden, we have this sense of urgency, to really move to the digital world. And now I think the main issue now is, how do we ensure that these digital digitalization initiatives in different countries in the region become interoperable, so that we do not get fragmented into digital islands. And this is something that is already gaining a lot of attention. As I have said in my earlier presentation, the work on this is still very early, but I think this is being accelerated by our experience with COVID.
Thank you, JC. Madam Prime Minister, would you like to give us your...
Well, I've spent much of the last 15 months, I suppose, very focused on doing a major review for the World Health Assembly on the experience of COVID and what lessons we can learn from it. And in a nutshell, we've made a lot of quite far-reaching recommendations. But I think what's also of interest to me is how, once again, what is it said? Necessity is the mother of invention, and we've all had to adapt. Businesses had to adapt. When we first went into lockdowns in New Zealand in March last year, bigger business, which was used to operating online for sales and delivery, adapted quite quickly. But the high street, the main street trader, whose reputation was very much on the face-to-face interaction with the customer, tended to miss out a lot. And then as we've gone on with, in and out of this lockdown, that lockdown, down to, a lot of the SMEs, people have worked out how to work online. And I think there will be, ongoing productivity and other savings from that. As well, the delivery of healthcare has changed enormously, again, through necessity. There'll be many things, I think, we never go back to face-to-face consultations for, with, for example, our general practitioner or our specialist. So much more will be done remotely. You may do it by smartphone with your doctor. You may be sending them a photo. They'll be sending you the home test kit. So much more is going to be done without the patient actually going into the surgery. And then in education, where countries were able to adapt quickly to online learning, the children haven't missed out so much, but where they've missed out is where there wasn't that infrastructure of broadband connectivity. I saw a figure somewhere that if you take the poorest 20% of people in rural Ethiopia, only 7% even have a radio. So you can't even deliver the lessons for school by radio. So, I think the pandemic has shed a light on a lot of aspects of our societies and our practices. We've seen a lot of innovation, and of course the scientific innovation has been such a critical part of helping us get out of this. The innovation on the tests, on the vaccines, on the increasingly on the therapeutics. This is immensely important. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned out of COVID. And let me just sort of end with one. In so many ways, it's been a pandemic of inequalities, hasn't it? When we've seen the poorest countries struggle to even get the vaccines, very inequitable rollout. And then within our own countries, where the pandemic has lingered or had a long tail, it's been among the most marginalised. It's been among the slum dwellers, the migrant workers, the people who use drugs, people pushed at the margins of society. And yet, with public health, if you don't include everybody in a response, you end up with a whole society affected. So it's got us thinking about a lot of those issues as well.
Yes, and just even the travel restrictions, quarantine restrictions, different countries, they're all different. So it's, well, thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. By the way, before I go to Lito to answer the same question, I'd like to invite the members of the audience, if they have any questions, please raise them, and the Secretariat to raise it if anybody submits. So Lito, can we hear your views?
But I think, as mentioned by the Prime Minister and by JC, this crisis has really brought out the best in people, in terms of being able to adjust and adapt to the environment. And I think it accelerated digitalization on all fronts. Science has progressed, etc., etc. No? I think the sad commentary, though, is that collectively we've not done as well. I think, as mentioned by the Prime Minister, you see that in the disparity in terms of the experiences, not only of between countries or amongst countries, but even amongst people within a country, right? And I think that's the sad commentary, and I think that's where the lessons should be learned, no? So that in another pandemic we can be much more cohesive in terms of our responses. I think the only thing that I see collectively is the COVAX facility, where there's a joint effort to provide to some of the poorest countries some vaccine, but I don't think it has really been it's been substantial enough to really move the needle. I wish there were a lot more collective actions that were taken. You mentioned about travel. I mean, just think about something as simple as a vaccination certificate. If every country adopted a different platform, a different technology for the vaccination certificate, how are we going to ever encourage mobility among countries, even if the vaccination rate have reached the level of herd immunity? Will a Singapore accept a vaccination certificate coming out of Manila or out of KL or out of Vietnam, etc.? Right? I mean, you have as many as 100 different programs to provide the testing results or the vaccination certificates. Those are things that could have been much more effective if done collectively. What if the ASEAN health ministers have come together and say, can we have an ASEAN vaccination certificate that we will all recognize? Or even within RCEP, all the members of RCEP, let's develop a certificate that everybody, same mobile application, app in your mobile device, etc. That would just bring us to recovery much faster. I think that's where I think we have failed as a global community. We've not been more collective in our efforts to fight this pandemic and the future that we're facing post the pandemic.
I agree completely, Lito. It's just mind-boggling to think that each country will have their own certificate and they're all different. By the way, I understand from the Secretariat that there's a question raised. Mike, I'd rather not shift out of my screen. Can you read it? Can you read it for the panelists to reply to?
Yeah, this came from an anonymous attendee. if we do have European Union in the West, can we have instead ASEAN Union for inclusive economy? But we have to exclude China as they are a major threat for ASEAN in the business ecosystem.
Okay, who would like to take that crack at it first?
If you may, I'll
Yeah,
just start
yeah,
the
go ahead.
discussion, yes, and then. But I would be excited to hear what the former Prime Minister will have to say, and JC. But I think the idea of an EU does not work in Asia or ASEAN or Asia. I think we're just too diverse in culture, in political, in history, in legacies. You know, our colonial past have been very different, diverse, etc. I think a political union is not feasible. I think an economic union is certainly on its way. I think, as I've mentioned, you know, if there's one thing that has worked in ASEAN, it's the trade union. No? It's the elimination of tariffs across almost 100% of all merchandise,
Yeah.
which allows really an ASEAN production base. I think that we've been successful in doing. To the distinction between the EU and everything else that's working around the world is the political union. That I don't see will ever happen, not in my lifetime.
Thank you, Lito. Madam Prime Minister, can we get your views on this?
Well, I agree. And I think actually a political union can be a step too far. I think that the United Kingdom would probably still be in the European Union today if the integration hadn't tried to go to. The UK always favoured a broader and less deep union. But, you know, there were other forces driving for a deeper and broader union. And, you know, speaking as someone whose entire family origins come from the British Isles, I just think it's a sad thing not to see Britain's future with Europe. But I think for ASEAN, it is an incredibly important regional institution, and one that, you know, New Zealand's been a close friend of from the time of its formation, and we really do support it and like to work with it. I think it faces a particular challenge at the moment, and that is the unconstitutional change of government in Myanmar. It has, of course, had a 5-point consensus agreement and has appointed a special envoy to go to try to work with all parties, if possible, on the restoration of constitutional government. It's very, very difficult. I think it's a huge crisis for ASEAN. And I think it's very important that you know, all of us from outside ASEAN, with an interest in and great, you know, affection for the region, really support ASEAN to do its job, because it's likely to, you know, to be the pathway to something better than Myanmar has today. So those would be my thoughts. We need a stronger ASEAN, but I think a political union is a step too far.
Thank you, Madam Prime Minister. JC?
Yeah, there has been a lot of discussion on this in the academic community. But I think, you know, it's really something. I mean, the European model is not really practical for Asia because of the diversity and also because of you know, the way we operate in Asia. So in Europe, it's basically you have supranational institutions, and even within Europe, there has been always this criticism that it's not very democratic, because you have, for example, a lot of bureaucrats who are driving the process, who are not really accountable to the peoples of the different member nations. You know, like the European Commission, for example, which has a lot of power, and so this has actually been a factor why, one of the factors why the UK left Europe, and why there has always been this undercurrent of criticism against, you know, what the EU as a group was doing. So I think we are more efficient in terms of how we have approached regional integration, and this is not through supranational institutions. We don't have, you know, this big you know, commission like the European Commission. We have a small secretariat in ASEAN, We have a small secretariat in APEC, but here it's really the member economies who are driving the process, and not some bureaucrats in one institution who are not accountable to the people of the member states.
Thank you, JC. I'll throw one more question. It comes from John Forbes. He says, crises often generate leaders. Who do you see in the Asian region now as a leader within the region? So maybe Lito first, then we go around again.
I don't know. Without flattering the former Prime Minister, I wish we had more of her today than the people that we have in those positions, right? I think we need somebody who truly represents inclusiveness, diversity, an advocacy for sustainability, etc. We need that kind of modern leader. To be honest, I struggle to find a good example of what would be an ideal leader for the future that we're facing, with the health issues, with the climate crisis, etc. Madam Prime Minister, it's been an honor to be with you on the same screen, and I'm a big fan, and I truly admire you and your advocacies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lita. Madam Prime Minister, would you have anybody in mind other than yourself?
Well, of course, my former employee, Miss Jacinda Ardern, has done quite well. When she was a new graduate, she was employed in my office to help prepare answers to parliamentary questions, and she's come a long way since then with a sort of pretty inclusive and strong response, obviously, to the pandemic. I mean, if I look around the region, I think one of the strongest pandemic responses came from Korea. I think the president there has led well. Look, it's just been such a tough issue. Some of the countries that did really well in the first wave then stumbled in the second and third wave. It's been a tough time. In general, I think we have a leadership vacuum in our world today. We're going to really miss Angela Merkel, who was such an anchor of leadership and stability for so long in Germany, and has just gone. But we're in the hands, at least in the democratic societies, of electorates as to who they elect, and they don't always make the best choices, in my opinion. So this is really a call, I guess, for people of vision and integrity and courage to step up, because you need a lot of that for politics, to see the longer term goals, the bigger picture, and to endeavour to take people with you and work in the common interest.
Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. JC?
Well, I agree with what has been said. It's very difficult to imagine, who could play a leadership role in the region, among the region's leaders right now.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to give each one of you a few minutes to give a closing remark before we close the session. May I start with Madam Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, it's been great to spend an hour with you and talk about these issues. As I said, I spent the 9 years as Prime Minister very immersed in regional economic integration discussions, many summits, many events, many bilateral visits, and got to know the region so well. I spent 8 years leading the UN Development Programme, and again, my organisation had a footprint throughout the region. It was very engaged with the economic development, human development, sustainable development journeys in the region. And all I can say is it's a privilege to be a citizen of the Asia Pacific, which is very dynamic, generally pretty forward looking, and let's keep talking like this across national borders and different political systems. That's the way we'll make progress.
Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. JC?
Yes, well, like the Madam Prime Minister, I'm very happy to be working with APEC. because I think that it's something that it could really contribute to, to closer relationship among the countries in the region, and really to promote regional integration. This year, New Zealand has done very, very well as the leader of APEC, and I'm very happy to note that Madame Clark is also going to be in our meeting of the APEC Business Advisory Council next month. So I'll be looking forward to hearing your remarks there. And especially in the area of finance, I'm very happy that we have a very good relationship in the business sector with the finance ministers. And Lito is very familiar with that because he's been part of that group too. But I think we're doing a lot of very useful things in promoting reforms in the region, pushing digitalization from the financial sector side, because the financial sector is really a key. It is the heart of the economy, and so what it does is very important for the rest of the economy.
Thank you, JC and Lito.
Well, thank you very much, Ebot, for very effectively moderating us. Again, I just want to repeat my my words about this being an honor to be sitting in the same virtual screen with the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, as well as JC, a fellow compatriot in sitting in Japan. It's really been a pleasure. I would just repeat some of the main points that I made during my earlier remarks. As I said, I think an integrated Asia Pacific is an ideal that we should all subscribe to. I can really appreciate the power of an integrated Asia Pacific, especially as we face global and regional challenges such as the pandemic, such as the climate change, etc. And but there are challenges that we're faced with. There are some realities that we need to confront. I hope that the U.S.-China conflict will. I think it will be there, but I hope it will not be disruptive to growth in Asia Pacific. I hope that we will be able to continue to engage both superpowers as individual economies and as a regional bloc. I do hope that China will develop, the soft skills, the soft power, so to speak, and be able to engage the region in a more diplomatic way, so that we can learn to work with each other. And their leadership role is undisputed. I mean, there's nobody who will dispute their economic and military and political leadership in the region. I hope that they will be able to treat their other Asian economies more kindly and with more benevolence, because I think that will be very bright for the future. And then thinking ahead, I hope that we will be able to successfully engage with India. I hope India will get its act together, be a much stronger economy, and that we can all mutually benefit, from a growth in India that we've seen in China over the last 4 decades. Thank you very much to FINEX, and then thank you, Ebot.
Thank you very much, Lito. It has indeed been an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure having been able to moderate these sessions with all three of you. I'd like to thank most especially former Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Helen Clark, for spending this time with us. It's already 9:30 p.m. her time. I'd like to also thank JC and Lito, who are both calling in from different countries. Maraming salamat, and thank you very much to all. Carlo, back to you.
Thank you. We would like to thank our speakers, Mr. Susantono, Mr. Camacho, and Dr. Parrenas. We would also like to thank the Right Honorable Helen Clark for joining the panel, and of course, to our moderator, Attorney Tan, for ably moderating the panel discussions, especially on the intricacies and, more importantly, on the huge opportunities of regional collaboration, cooperation, and integrations through enhanced dialogue and collective understanding within the Asia Pacific. Truly an engaging discussion today. Thank you. We would also like to thank our sponsors for this year's conference, our partners, Divina Law, LT Group of Companies, and Union Bank of the Philippines. Our platinum sponsors, Aboitiz Equity Ventures, Alliance Global Group Incorporated, First Philippine Holdings Corp., NOAA Business Applications, Robinson's Land Corporation, United Auctioneers Inc., and Vista Land and Lifescapes Inc., Our diamond sponsors, All Day Supermarket, All Home, Ayala Land Inc., Meralco, and Reyes Takandong and Company. Our knowledge partner, KPMG, RG Manabat and Company. Our gold sponsors, Acra Law, Bank of the
To our
Philippine
gold
Islands,
sponsors, Acra
Sirtec Holdings, Sirtec Holdings Philippines Corporation, Converge ICT Solutions Inc., Navarro Ampere and Company, Deloitte Philippines, FTI Consulting Inc., Metro Bank, Mount Denisian Corporation, PNA Grant and Thornton, RCBC, San Miguel Corporation, Filipina Shell Petroleum Corporation, SGV and Company, and Philinvest Development Corporation. Our patron sponsors, BDO Unibank Inc.,
to our gold
Mega World, Philippine National Bank, Security Bank, and Wilcon Depot and East West Bank. Our official broadcast partner, ABS-CBN News Channel. And lastly, our print media partners, Business Mirror, Business World, the Manila Times, and Daily Tribune. Once again, we would like to thank everyone for attending today's session of the FINEX Week Conference. We hope that you will continue to participate in the rest of our webinars this week. Thank you, everyone. Keep safe and have a great week ahead.
Thanks.
Bye all. Bye all.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.